conversation to have just after the commandments for the global, and we're going to see in practice, maybe learn, I don't know, real world practices of exactly doing what previous session. Nice to meet you, Ananth. Thanks for being part of the Conclave here. And I remember when we met last time that you told me that you're a wine collector and you're a wine connoisseur, right? And you're also an artist. Very interesting. And a lot of marathoners have taken life lessons from their long runs. And I would like to know, are there any lessons that you have learned to taste potential success of a business? Looks like there seems to be a secret sauce there.
So firstly, by the way, thank you for having me. I didn't expect that question. It's a good question. I think the only thing you can learn from wine, I think, is patience. Because I think wine ages over time. Businesses need to be made over time. And I think you need to be patient and build up businesses through an institution. It takes time. So I think that will be a lesson. And I think the second one is, independent of whether you're a startup or not, having some kind of work. It makes you a better startup entrepreneur. I think.
Absolutely. And just reading a bit about wine and in terms of, the science of sensory perception, this cognitive psychology, right? A lot getting into that. And on that note, I don't know, I just want to ask, how many of you heard about Mensa brands? And Ananth Narayanan together? Fair amount. I think there's a lot of awareness in our audience. Can you actually tell us what Mensa is up to? And how you decided where to play? We all hear that, we have seen growth in some linear form. I think at least the way that Mensa has gone through in the last 12 odd months, it's been phenomenal. And how you thought about creating a right to win in this area? And I'm sure still a long way ahead, but...
No, I think it's day one, so I don't think we've gotten anywhere close to, right to win and all that. But just what we try to do at Mensa is build a global tech-led house of brands. So think of it as a new age version of building out a Unilever or a Marico, whatever, right? I mean, essentially, brands get built very differently now, I think, just with the mobile internet, consumer internet penetration, and distribution being very democratized, right? All these factors make brand building very different. So I think that's what we're trying to do. On the where to play, I think my first fundamental belief is 80% of success is on the where to play. I think, of course, you need to then follow through and execute well. But I think playing in a large pond matters. So the macro is fashion plus beauty plus also lifestyle categories. These are high gross margin and high market size business. It's $120 billion in just India, and then if you add exports, it's much larger. And therefore building, and the interesting factoid is there are less than 30 brands over 1,000 crores in annual revenue in this fast space. And the reason why it's been very hard to build brands is distribution has been difficult, brand building is very expensive, and there's a high mortality rate, and India is still very unbranded. So the reason we picked this area is it's a large space, so the where to play matters. Second, you can build a sustainable business because we don't have gross margins, it's very hard to make money. And I think eventually businesses, in the last session I saw there was, you eventually need cash flows. And so having high gross margins and picking a high gross margin business is the second reason on the where to play. And the third is, in general, in the online world, in a browse category as opposed to a utilitarian category, it's easier to build a brand. Right? Because you can inspire people to brand. Easier to build a brand in fashion than, in utilities, right? And so it's just, so these are the three reasons why we picked it. We've been quite fortunate. It's been a good start, but it's still very much day one for us. We have about 20 brands in our portfolio across fashion, beauty, and home. Starting to build out some interesting breakout brands from sort of fashion to gardening to beauty. So it's been interesting as a journey.
A lot of people here are actually from the technology industry, either running a B2B or B2C businesses. And how do you think about maybe your inputs on, are they also building brand in some form, and how do they look at this?
Yeah. So I think a brand is something that has meaning and ties to consumers. So I think everybody at some point is building a brand. The way maybe I would answer this question, a slightly different take on it, is if you think about brand building in the consumer world, right? I think for the first time you actually have history, you can't really hide, right? I mean, just from a consumer experience standpoint, reputation compounds, your consumer experience compounds, because the digital trail exists for a while. So you think about brand building, the way we think about it is the digital brand building is very, very different. The feedback is instantaneous. You know, you get told quite quickly. So being able to actually have a top decile of consumer experience is critical in building a digital brand in these days, and that's hard to do. The second is, I think tech, since there are many people from tech, I think one of the things that we are trying to do is, you take every element of brand building, you can productize it in some way, since we're in the NPC event, right? So you take pricing, you take portfolio, you take assortment, you take merchandising, you take inventory planning. All of these, I think, over time can be productized. And the reason, therefore, to have a portfolio is that the tech sort of goes across and helps you do the non-linear things we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. And you're talking about where to play significantly plays a role in the success of a startup.
So,
Right now, is there any framework for, let's say, many of us start because I'm good at it, right? I know this well, I'm passionate about it, let me start. Right?
Yeah.
Is there a framework to see whether am I actually choosing the right place, am I playing the right game?
So the short answer is, of course, you can be successful at anything, but the way at least the lens that I use, even for some of the angel investing that I do, is I think there are only two real filters. Is it a large market? And is it a complicated problem that you can solve? If the answer is yes to both, and you think that the person will persevere, then it's probably a good space. The reason I talk about the large market is, life is very hard as a startup entrepreneur. I think life is very hard in startup in general. If you're going to work that hard, you might as well play for something that where if you actually succeed, the outcomes are outsized, right? So therefore, I think picking a large market is quite important. And I would say maybe large and profitable sort of go together for me. And I think complicated problem is important. The reason is if you don't have a complicated problem, then all the profits get competed out because there's just too many competitors, right? So if it's a complicated problem, large market and a complicated problem, then I think building a very successful startup becomes quite interesting. So that's the framework I use even for thinking about exit investing, not just Mensa.
Very interesting and useful, and one of the things, it was there also in the commandments, is about thinking big, and you keep talking about thinking big.
Right.
Now, thinking big is relative.
Yeah.
Right? You might be happy to thinking bigger than somebody else, but really blowing it out. What comes in way of not thinking big, and is there any practice of checking yourself, am I thinking big enough?
Yeah, I think, one of my mentors used to tell me that the ambition of what you're trying to do doesn't scare you a little bit, at least. You're not thinking big, right? So it's a little bit of a qualitative view, but so we have brands that we think can be 1,500, 2,000 crores, right? They're today 30 crores. So it's a very large jump, and it's over the next 4 years. And you sort of basically say, look, unless you think it's almost unreasonable, it's probably not big enough in terms of how much you should think about ambition. I think that's number one. I think number two in terms of thinking big is actually the team. I think if you have a great founding team who sort of build off each other, don't always agree with one another, but actually push each other, I think then you start to also improve the ambition levels of the organization. I don't think it's a single person thing, I think it's a organizational value. One of our values, by the way, is thinking big.
I think maybe setting scary goals is a point that I'm taking away here. But let's move. Building one brand takes so much of effort, right? And it sometimes looks very scary, and I keep thinking about it, right? And how you guys already bought 20 plus brands,
Right.
And also scaled. I heard one of the brands you already scaled 10x.
Yes.
Villain or something, right? And how do you and your team grow such a diverse portfolio across three sectors?
Yeah. So firstly, by the way, I don't think this is easy answer. I think what we're doing is actually reasonably tough, except for the cross-cutting tech pieces. It is hard to build brands, and I think it takes a long time to build them. I think we're very early in the journey. But I think a few of the things that has helped us work across the portfolio as opposed to individual brands is the core of the brand and the brand building, in the sense of it sits within each brand, right? So, many times the founder who we're partnered with will continue with us, or we have a brand owner and we call them a brand owner and not anything else. Even if it's not the founder, it's still a brand owner. They sort of provide the design, the marketing, and the branding. What you do actually are all the boring things which actually prevent scale. What are the boring things that prevent scale in our organization? It's talent, it's a bit around technology and how do you actually think about each of the processes. It's around all of the core things around operations, inventory management, warehouse management. All of these things I think are quite tough to do. And what happens is their scale helps. If you have 20 brands, your ability to go to a celebrity agency and negotiate a contract becomes better. Your ability to go and strike a partnership with AWS becomes better. Your ability to go to platforms and talk to them become better. Right? So all of that changes. So you have synergies of scope and scale across a variety of them. But the core of how you build a brand, we actually have a brand owner whose only role in life is how do you actually grow this as a real brand and how do you scale this as a real brand. And that's just got revenues and EBITDA. I think that's actually making sure the brand means something, consumer experience continues to go up, products get released that actually are delightful to the customer. So all that, right? So there's real brand owners that own that. And then the reason it helps us is we have a bunch of elements that can scale across, that benefit and scale.
How big is role of technology in this non-linear?
I think it's incredibly important. The reason we've been able to sort of scale to the size that we have done, and the reason we've been able to, so I think buying the brand is not the difficult part. The difficult part actually is growing and scaling the brand. I think that's the core of what we do. And that is only possible through technology. I'll give you a simple example. If you take pricing, we have 10,000 plus SKUs now across 20 brands, and we have 6-7 platforms. If you start to do pricing in a manual manner, it's impossible. So you need algorithms, you need data, you need to be able to actually price using tech. I would say the same thing is true for inventory management, right? You have 10,000 SKUs, you have 4 warehouses, you have 6 platforms. It starts to get complicated. So each element of what we do as far as brand building is concerned actually is done through tech. And that's the only way, I think, for us to be able to manage multiple brands and do it without sort of replicating resources, right? Which makes it unviable.
But technology is actually taking over all the boring areas.
I think, I would say even the non-boring area, right? So for example, if you think about an assortment planning and what you want to sort of make next year, and Ganesh, you know this, but for example, what color to choose for the assortment for Spring Summer 23 in one of our fashion brands, you can get more through tech, right? As opposed to actually saying, I let the designer pick whatever they want. So I think both the boring and the non-boring parts can be transformed through tech, and I think that's a little bit of the secret sauce of what we said. Similarly, if you think about how do you actually integrate with a Mensa or a Flipkart or an Amazon or a Nykaa, it's really important to sort of say you understand the algorithms of work and therefore are able to do growth hacking dramatically well in each of them. Each platform actually values something different, right? Some value velocity, some value newness and freshness. So understanding your end customer well, and therefore being able to again use tech to drive scale each of these platforms is another area where tech can play a big role.
That's a great segue into a question I think any of the audience would be interested is that how do you choose? Do you buy tech or do you build tech?
Yeah. So this is sort of the eternal question. I think during my Mensa days and MedLife days, I think we built far more than we probably should have. I think we have a very simple framework. We sort of think about what is core to us in terms of long-term differentiation and what is not. Anything that's not core, we still try and solve through tech, but we end up doing it through partnerships. We try and do it through the long term. I mean, do we need to build a warehouse management system when everybody has a warehouse management system? The answer is probably not. You have to pick the right partner and go with it. Do you have to build the pricing algorithm in-house? The answer is absolutely yes. So I think for every area of tech, we sort of think about core versus non-core. And anything core we want to build and sort of it learns over time. Even the non-core pieces, we try not to be transactional because I think tech needs to take a while. So we actually have partnerships with companies that do it.
Wonderful. I'm sure there are lots of opportunities for tech companies in that front. Now let's go to the theme of NPC, which is World Class from India.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting for all of us to understand how you think about building brands for the world and learning you had from this experience.
So today, if I look at our revenues, 30% comes from outside India. So we sell in the US, we sell in the Middle East, we started selling a little bit in Singapore, and it's growing and growing quite rapidly. One question I always ask myself is, give you a fashion and then give you example. If you take a fashion example, most of the large global brands source from it, whether it's Zara, whether it's H&M, but we don't build global brands from it. The question is why, right? I mean, all of it happens here, but we don't actually do it, and I think that's one of the things we're trying to correct. And I think part of this is in the previous session, people talk about ambition. Nobody thinks that you can build a brand from here. I think you can absolutely build global brands from here. In fashion, in beauty, and home. And I think they will be global leaders, not just people who follow. And I think firstly, winning that and making sure that you believe in your head and your team believes it is important. The second, I think, is look, tech levels many things. Once you understand, I'll give you a simple example. In Amazon, reviews and ratings become a moat over time. So we have brands that have 10,000 plus reviews on a single SKU. If you actually now go to the US with that, you have an instant advantage because you come up on top of the algorithm. So, many of our brands, I'll give you an example. We have a super brand called Folk Culture, which does home decor, right? And it competes with the Anthropologies of the world in the US. And in Amazon, it's among the best performing brands, right? Likewise, I can give you an example after example, but I think India's decade for the next 10 years, I think this is our decade. I think we have now critical scale in India for us to be able to build. And because you have that critical scale, you can then use that to actually invest to build globally. And I think it's a huge opportunity over the next 10 years. Clearly, I think people in SaaS have done it. I think in consumer, it's been less the case. I think it's very possible, and I think consumer needs and trends are now much easier to understand because of tech and because of common platforms. Right? We have a brand called Conclave, which is a sari brand, right? 50% of the revenue now comes from outside India.
That's amazing. That's amazing, Ananth. I think being in the retail for so long, very rare to see Indian brands going global. Right, we keep talking about the Inditex, the Zara of the world.
Right.
Looking forward to some of the portfolio brands going really global very soon. Now, touch on digital brand building. I think I have understood that you're building a digital Unilever, right, or an Inditex. Inditex, for many of you, if you're not from the fashion industry, is a conglomeration. It's a Spanish conglomerate of multiple brands, one of the leading fashion houses in the world. From your experience, how are brands being built these days, and how is it different from the current way of doing it?
So, how many of you actually go online and refer a brand? If you buy something in fashion, let's say you're going to buy something, how many of you go do some research online? Is it time for coffee? Are you guys all listening? All right, okay, wonderful. I think that's about 70% of the room. The reason I ask is, even if you don't buy online, so today online sales as a percentage of retail in the spaces that I'm talking about is about 8-9%. Went up to 9.5 during COVID and it's sort of back to 8. But the number of people researching brands online is north of 50%. So brand building, therefore, happens online much more. I think that's one phenomenon that's changed. And therefore, having a digital reputation online, having consumer experience and reviews and ratings online become very important. And that's one thing that's changed. The second thing that's changed is brand building used to be very much of the brand telling the consumer what they stood for. Right? It was much more about having a large celebrity and basically telling consumers this is what the brand stands for. I think that's changed dramatically with the new generation of shoppers because most people value what their community says or what their friends say dramatically more than what an influencer or a celebrity says. Therefore, ability to build brands using influencers, not the large ones, but micro influencers, and actually be part of a community really starts to make a difference, right? Many of our brands, are quite integral. I mean, we have a brand called Trust Basket, which is the largest gardening brand online in the country, and that actually is part of very large Facebook communities, very large Instagram communities. There are not influencer-led, but there are genuinely people who like gardening and horticulture, and we are part of those communities, and that's how brands get it, right? So I think these two big things have changed, and therefore brand building will be done much differently than how you build brands 20 years ago.
Very interesting, and we can see some of the community commandments in action straight away here. Before I move on, asking one tough question to Ananth, and I heard Ananth through another podcast where he had the humility of talking about how many of us actually post a setback in social media. Just raise your hands. Credit to Ananth. This question is not mine. How many of us really go back and say, I failed in investment, right? I screwed up in something. Very rarely, right? But we don't talk about challenges at all. We always put our best face forward. So I'm going to ask you that question, right? No business is without challenges, right? We see all the positive stories. So with the macroeconomic scenario which is going through a tough time right now,
Yeah.
what are the one or two key challenges you are facing and how are you trying to tackle it?
Yeah, no, firstly, I think it's a great question because for some reason social media amplifies many things, including our own insecurity. So I think lots of challenges. I think, look, our business model has two parts to it. One is we buy brands, and the other is we grow, right? And I think currently, while it's a big positive that generally there is a little bit of I'll tell you the positive about the current situation, then I'll tell you a little bit about the challenges. The positive in the current situation is, I think the lack of overheated valuations means there's sanity in the market, sanity in the investor community, sanity, I think, in hiring talent. I think which are all very, very good things. However, I think for most businesses, you need continuous inputs of capital that need to come in. Not just because you're burning cash or whatever, which I think we reduce, but I think also just eventually just even grow, right? So I think that becomes harder and the bar becomes higher. We have been sort of EBITDA positive from the very beginning. And so the interesting thing somebody was asking is now it's all about an EBITDA multiple and a discounted cash flow. And I think it always has been. I think every now and then people sort of project out into the future and say that things will get better. I think that path has now come down and I think that's a good.
Interesting. I really enjoyed talking to you, but I just want to allow maybe for one or two questions from the audience. If you have any questions. Anyone?
So you talked about brands not being grown out of India, whereas everything else is being done in India except at the time. Is it more about just the ambition, lack of ambition, like we were talking earlier, or is it also the skill set to design, understand, analyze, put a bet on? Are all those things still missing, especially in the sort of fashion industry, as an example?
I don't think so. I think a lot of design, for example, for many of the global brands happens in India. So I think we certainly have a skill set.
I'm not sure many people in the audience knew that.
No. So I think today, if you think about it, you take Zara, you take H&M, you take any of these. A lot of design and design thinking and input happens from suppliers who supply to them, right? The design language just doesn't come one way. I think it goes both ways. So I think the skill sets exist. I think maybe the nuanced question there is how do you understand consumers in a different country very well? And I think that is harder to do. However, because you now have common global platforms, whether it's a D2C platform that sells online or an Amazon of the world, you can go check out competing products and understand competitive products and what consumers want very easily, right? And that becomes, and that did not exist 10 years ago. So, for example, we have a brand, a fashion brand called NASSCOM, which is very, very fast selling in India. It makes men's casual wear. Now we're launching in the US. It's very easy to go on Amazon and find out at the price point that you want to do. What are the 5 competitors, what are they doing? And therefore your ability to sort of get a sense of what the consumer wants in a fact-based manner has changed dramatically. And I think that wasn't there 10 years ago. So that I think is a trend that's making this more possible.
One more question.
Yeah.
Since fashion and we are actually very far apart, it's gone to technology. So, as a startup, how do we approach brand building? There's a basic amount of shyness that comes into building brands when talking about marketing and stuff like that. So, how do you approach this? How do you build a brand as a startup so that you know that okay, I've got enough amount of customer validation, I've got revenues. Now I want the world to know about me. So how do you start at that point in time as a tech company?
So firstly, by the way, fashion and me are also quite far apart. I did 15 years of automotive. I think my first fashion experience was Mensa. So just maybe 2 ways to answer that. I think reputation in life compounds. I think as much as money does. So being consistent about what you do as a startup. And I think, in the previous session, there were things about integrity and, being consistent and being good to your investors. I think these are the things that actually help build your brand as a startup, right? Governance helps. Taking care of your investors during tough times helps. I mean, these are all very, these are difficult things to do, and that's why it's difficult to have a great reputation, right? So being consistent over time and knowing that reputation compounds is really important. And once it goes down, it has to start from scratch again. It's very difficult. So keeping those two in mind helps. Second is, it depends on what you're building the brand for. Is it for employees? Is it for investors? Because if it's for investors and capital and so on, very different, right? It's a very narrow set of people that you need to do, and you need to tell your story to. If it is employees, I would say, by the way you actually get employees into your startup and exit them out of your startup and everything in between, I think is what's going to build your reputation. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's less around marketing and branding for me. It's around reputation building as a startup. And reputation building, I think, is really important, independent of the stage at which you got it as a startup.
That's
So
an amazing
basically,
piece.
sorry. So you basically, when you talk about reputation building, you're talking about, success stories, talking about asking your employees to come and talk about the organization. Is that what you're referring to?
I think it's all of the above. I think it's both the success stories and sometimes things that don't actually work as well. And I think, talking about them is the easy part. The question is who you're talking to. And I think you should be clear about it. I think, again, if it's people you want to attract talent into the company to, then you talk about it by getting the people who work in your startup to actually go talk about it. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. And for those who have questions or not asked, I would recommend that there has been a recent podcast which Ananth gave. It's around 100 minutes podcast. If you follow Mensa, you will see that. I personally found a lot of enriching inputs which Ananth has shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again,
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
So to thank Ananth once again for joining us on this fireside chat. We'd like to also thank Ganesh for moderating that session. Small token of appreciation going out to Ananth and Ganesh.